What's new? He asked True as he came up. Panaloo has agreed to replace Rambert in the quarantine ward. He has done a lot already. We still have to recognize the third exploratory group without Rambert. Ryu nodded. Castell has completed his first vaccines and suggested carrying out a trial. Ah, said Ryu. That's good. And Rambert is here. Ryu turned around. His eyes narrowed above the mask when he saw the journalist. What are you doing here? You should be somewhere else. True said that it was for tonight at midnight, and Rambert added, in theory. Every time one of them spoke, the gauze mask puffed a little out, grew damped with the mouth. This made the conversation slightly unreal, like the dialogue between statues. I'd like to talk to you, said Rambert. We'll leave together if you like. Wait for me and Teru's office. A moment later, Rambert and Ryu were settling into the back of the doctor's car. Teru was driving. No more fuel, he said, staring at the engine. Tomorrow we'll have to walk. Doctor, said Rambert, I'm not leaving. I want to stay with you. Teru did not flinch. He carried on driving. Ryu appeared incapable of escaping from the fatigue. What about her? He said in a dull voice. Rambert said that he had thought it all over again. He still believed what he believed, but if he went away, he would feel ashamed. It would make him uncomfortable loving a woman he had left. But Ryu sat up and said familiar that it was ridiculous and that there was no shame in choosing happiness. Yes, said Rambert, but there may be shame in being happy all by oneself. True, who had said nothing up till now, remarked without turning his head that if Rambert wanted to share the misfortune of mankind, he would never again have time for happiness. You had to choose. That's not it, said Rambert. I've always thought that I was a stranger in this town. I had nothing to do with you. But now I have seen what I have seen, and I know that I have come from here. Whether I'd like it or not, this business concerns all of us. No one answered, and Rambert seemed irritated. In any case, you know that as well as I do. Otherwise, what are you doing in that hospital of yours? Have you made your choice then? Have you given up on happiness? Still neither Teru nor Ryu answered. The silence lasted a long time until they were close to the doctor's house. Once more, Rambert asked his last question, still more empathetically. Only Ryu turned towards him, raising himself with difficulty. I'm sorry, Rambert, he said, but I don't know. Stay with us if that's what you want. He was silenced as the car swerved, and carried on looking straight ahead. Nothing in the world should turn you away from what you love, and yet I too am turning away without understanding why. He slumped back into a seat. It's a fact, that's all, he said wearily. That let's just acknowledge it and draw the necessary conclusions. What conclusions? Rambert said. Oh, Ryu said. One can't heal and know at the same time. So let's heal as fast as we can. That's the most urgent thing. At midnight, Teru and Ryu were giving Rambert the plans of the district which we had to investigate, and Teru looked at his watch, raising his head to meet Rambert's eyes. Did you let them know? The journalist looked away. I sent a note, he said in a strained voice, before I came to see you. It was the last days of October, and they tried out Castell's serum. In practical terms, this was Ryu's last hope. In the event of the new failure, the doctor was convinced that the town would have to surrender to the whims of the disease. Either the epidemic would continue for so long months yet, or it would decease and call a halt for no reason. On the eve of the day when Castell came to see Ryu, Amothon's son fell ill, and the whole family had to go into quarantine. The mother, who had only recently emerged from quarantine, was thus isolated for the second time. Obsolete in the instructions he had given, the judge had Ryu brought in as soon as he recognized the signs of the disease on the child's body. When Ryu arrived, the mother and father were standing at the foot of the bed. The little girl had been sent off, and the child was in a phase of exhaustion and allowed him to be examined without a fuss. When the doctor looked up, he met the magistrate's eyes and saw behind him the pale face of the mother who had put a handkerchief over her face and was following the doctor's movements with wide open eyes. "That's it, isn't it?" said the magistrate with a cold voice. "Yes," Ryu replied, looking back at the child. The mother's eyes widened, but still said nothing. The magistrate was so silent then that the low voice he said, "Well, doctor, we have to do what we are required to do." Ryu avoided the eyes of the mother, who was still holding a handkerchief to her mouth. "It won't take long," he said hesitantly. "If I might use your phone." Othone said he would show him where it was, but the doctor turned to the magistrate's wife. "I'm very sorry. You must get some things together. You know what's needed." Madame Othone seemed struck dumb. She was staring at the ground. "Yes," she said, nodding. I'll do that." Before he left them, Ryu could not stop himself asking if they needed anything. The woman kept looking at him in silence, but this time the magistrate looked away. "No," he said then, swallowing, "but save my child." At the start of quarantine, they had been simplified formality. Now Ryu and Rambert had to organize it very strictly. In particular, they demanded that the members of the family should always be isolated from one another. If one person in the family had been infected without realizing it, they should not increase the chances of illness spreading. Ryu explained this to the magistrate, who had persuaded by an argument. However, the magistrate and his wife were looking at one another in such a way that the doctor felt how devastating the separation would be for them. Madame Othone and her young daughter could be housed in a quarantine hotel run by Rambert, but the magistrate there had no place there any longer except for the isolated camps in which the prefecture was setting up in the municipal stadium, and with the help of tents provided by the refuse collection service. Ryu apologized, but Othone said that there was only one law for everyone, and that was the right to obey it. As for the child, he was taken to the auxiliary hospital, to a former classroom in which the 10 beds had been set up. After some 20 hours, Ryu considered his case desperate. The little boy was being eaten up by the infection without reacting. Teeny blue bones painfully were bare-formed and were obstructing the joints of his slender limbs. He was beaten from the start. This was why Ryu had the idea of trying out Castile serum on him. That evening after dinner, they had given the long injection without a single reaction from the child. At dawn of the next day, they all went to the little boy's bedside and assessed the results of the dissective experiment. The child, who had emerged from his titer, was turning convulsing under the sheets. The doctor, Castile, and Teru had been beside him since 4 o'clock in the morning, following the disease as it advanced and retreated. Teru's solid frame was slightly hunched at the head of the bed. Ryu was standing at the foot of the bed, and beside him Castile sat and read some old books, with every appearance of calm. Little by little, as daylight spread through the old schoolroom, the others arrived. First Penalou, who took up his position on the other side of the bed from Teru, and his back against the wall. His face wore a pained expression, and the exhaustion of so many days in which he had given to others in the expanse of his own well-being had drawn lines across his flushed forehead. Joseph Grand arrived in his turn. It was 7 o'clock, and the civil servant apologized for being out of breath. He would only stay for moments. Perhaps they already knew something definite. Without a word, Ryu showed him the child, whose eyes were closed and a contorted face. His teeth clenched as hard as they could clench, and his body was motionless. He was turning his head back and forth, from right to left, in the bluster of no sheets across it. When it was finally light enough for one to see the blackboard, which had remained at the back of the room, with some old equations on it, Robert came. He leaned against the back of the next bed and brought out a pack of cigarettes, but after looking at the child, put it back in his pocket. Castile was still sitting down and looked at Ryu over his glasses. "Any news of the father?" "No," Ryu said. "He's in an isolation hospital." The doctor was grasping the iron bar at the foot of the bed, and the child was groaning. He never took his eyes off the little patient, who stiffened and suddenly once more clenched his teeth, arched his back a little at the waist, slowly extending his arms and legs. The small body, naked under the army blanket, gave off the acidic smell of sweat and wool. The child gradually relaxed and brought his arms and legs back towards the center of his body, and still blind and dumb, seemed to be breathing more rapidly. Ryu looked towards Teru, who turned away. They had already seen children die, for several months of terror and discriminate of the victims. But never had they followed a child suffering minute by minute. They had been doing here since early morning. Of course, the pain insufficient to those incidents had never ceased to appear to them with the truth that it was an outrage. But until they had been outraged abstractly, in a sense, because they had never looked face to face for so long at a time at the death of the innocent child. For a moment the boy had, as though biting his stomach, doubled again in a high-pitched moan, and remained bent like this for several seconds, shaking and trembling convulsively, as though his frail body had below breathed and ragged the wind of the plague and cracking under the repeated blast of the fever. Once the gust had passed, he relaxed a little. His fever seemed to move away, abandoning him, grasping the damp and polluting shores the rest of the way that seemed like death. When the burning tides struck him again, third time he raised up a little, and the child bent double and throwing back of his blankets, fled to the end of the bed, wildly shaking his head from side to side, in terror of the flames that were burning him. Large tears rose beneath the swollen eyelids and began to flow down his plaid face, and the cries were over, exhausted, tensing his bony legs and arms from which the 48 hours of flesh had dropped away. The child assumed the geostraight pose and was the convulsing man on the ravaged bed. Teru leant over and with a heavy hand whipped the small face bathed in tears and sweat. Moments earlier, Castile had closed his book and was looking at the patient. He began to say something, but had to cough in order to finish it, because his voice suddenly started to crack. There was no morning remission, was there, Teru? Ryu said no, but the child was holding on longer than normal. Hanlu, who seemed to have stumbled somewhat against the wall, said in a very dull voice, "If he is to die, he will have suffered longer." Ryu turned briskly towards him and opened his mouth to say something, but then thought better of it and looked back towards the child, making a visible effort to control himself. The light spread through the ward, and the other 5 beds shaped were tossing and groaning, and they appeared to be deliberate self-restraints. The only ones who were shouting at the other end of the ward were making little cries of regular intervals, and seemed to express astonishment rather than pain. Now there were kinds of assent in the manner of approaching the disease. Only the child was struggling with all his strength. From time to time, Ryu would take a pulse, unnecessarily and rather to escape the state of powerless inactivity in which he found himself. And when he closed his eyes, he could feel the agitation mingle in the throbbing of his own veins. In such times he felt himself merged with the marauded child and tried to sustain him with all that he could, undetermined strength, and beneath the 2 hearts until the minute would cease and harmonize, the child escaped him in his efforts to dissolve the nothingness. At this he would put down the slender wrist and go back to his place. Along the whitewashed walls, light changed from pink to yellow. Behind the glass of the hot morning was starting to crackle. One could hardly hear Grand, as he left, saying that he would come back. They all waited, the child's eyes still shut, seemed to be slightly calmer. His hands were like claws. They were gently working towards the sides of the bed, and they climbed upwards, stretching the blankets near the knees, and suddenly he bent his legs, brought it his thighs up near his belly and became still. At this point, he opened his eyes for the first time and looked at Ryu, who was standing in front of him, a hollowed of the face, as if fixed on the gray clay. The mouth opened, and almost immediately a single continuous cry came out, hardly altered by the boy's breath, suddenly filling the room with a monstrous, discordant protest, so inhuman that he seemed to be coming from all the men at once. Ryu gritted his teeth, and Teru turned away. Robert went up to the bedside. Castell closed his book, which he stayed open at his knees. Panlu looked at the child's mouth, soiled by the illness, full of the cry of all the ages. He knelt, and everyone considered it a natural for hear him say, in a voice that somewhat stifled the district, behind the continuing anomalously howl, "My God, save this child!" But the child went on crying, and all around him the patrons were becoming restless. One at the end of the ward, whose shouts had not stopped, stepped up the rhythm of his moans until it too became the genuine cry. While the others groaned louder and louder, the tide of the sobs broke out across the room, drowning out Penelope's prayers, and Ryu clasped the bar at the foot of the bed, closed his eyes, drunk with the tiredness of horror. When he opened them again, he found Teru beside him. "I have to go," said Ryu. "I can't stand this anymore." But abruptly the patients fell silent, and the doctor realized that the child's cries had weakened, and it was still wrecking, and it was hard to stop. Around him the moans resumed, and smooth like a distant echo, struggling that had just ended. For ended it had. Castell went around to the other side of the bed, said that it was all over. His mouth open but silent. The child was resting among the repulsive blankets, suddenly grown smaller, traces of tears on his face. Panlu went up to the bed and made a sign of the benediction, and he gathered up his robes and went out to the central aisles. "Must we start all over again?" Teru asked Castell. The old doctor shook his head. "Perhaps," he said, while a strained smile. After all, he did fight it for a long time. But Ryu was already going out the ward, walking so quickly that he, with such a look on his face, that he overtook Panelu. The priest held his arm to restrain him. "Come now, doctor," he said. Without stopping, as he swept along, Ryu turned around and spat out. "Ah, now that one, at last, the innocent, as you very well know." He turned away, and going through the doors of the ward in front of Panlu, crossed back to the school courtyard. He sat down on the bench between the dusty little trees, wiped away the sweat and already running into his eyes. He wanted to shout out again, untie the dreadful knot crushing his heart. The heat followed slowly down between the branches of the fig trees. Blue morning sky was quickly covered by the whitish film that made the air stiffening even then. Ryu slumped back at the bench and watched the branches of the sky gradually getting back from his breath, bit by bit absorbing his fatigue. "Why did you speak to me with such anger just now?" said the voice behind him. I, too, found it unbearable to watch. Ryu turned around to Panelu. "That's true," he said. "Forgive me, but my tiredness is a form of madness, and there is time in the town that I can only feel an outrage and revolt."